we are alive. For those of you who have already joined, we're just going to wait a couple more minutes before we get started. Can you, somebody who has already joined, just confirm that the sound is okay? Thank you, Kanit. Okay, great. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for this short-ish presentation of the third niyama, which is tapas, also known as asceticism. So, namaste. Thank you. Thank you for joining. So, what is tapas? We'll spend roughly 30 minutes or so discussing this topic. Maybe we'll go a little bit over. Let's see. And then there'll be time for a short Q&A session at the end where I'll invite any questions using the comments box. So tapas. Tapas is also known as asceticism. And for those of you who don't know what asceticism means, it simply means self-discipline, or in some cases, severe self-discipline, through the practice of austerities or not following one's desires as a means to attain union with the divine, which is the purpose of yoga. So we can also say tapas is asceticism, austerities, or self-discipline. And there are a few things that we'll be covering in this lecture. So first and foremost, we'll do a short introduction, followed by looking at tapas in other spiritual traditions, such as Christianity and Islam. And throughout the presentation, I will be referring to the correct attitudes in which to practice tapas. And to conclude, if we have time, I will shortly talk about the effects of a regular tapas practice that a regular tapas practice can have on daily life, on our life. So to begin with, and as I already mentioned, tapas is the third niyama. And niyama, there are 5 of them. Niyama simply means without constraint. So we can say that the niyamas are to be observed endlessly or without constraint by a spiritual aspirant. You may have also heard of the yamas. So yamas, which means with constraint. So the yamas and the niyamas, they are the first 2 limbs of a form of Raja Yoga, more commonly known as Patanjali's 8 limbs of yoga. And we can imagine the yamas and the niyamas as the legs. And if we do not follow or practice the yamas and the niyamas, we cannot expect to walk the spiritual path. And tapas is as instrumental as any, we can say, although they are all closely related. The Bhagavad Gita, the Song of God, which is a Hindu text, it talks of austerities of the body, the mind, and speech. And austerities of the body, for example, it refers to ahimsa, which is non-violence, the practice of non-violence, brahmacharya, sexual continence, and saucha, purity. So it is saying that without tapas, without self-discipline, none of these other yamas or niyamas can actually be practiced. And this is the importance of tapas. So we can look at some words from spiritual masters on what they or how they view tapas. And we will begin with Paramahansa Yogananda, who was a 19th century Hindu monk and spiritual teacher. And he says, tapas, austerity, is the conscientious practice of disciplines that bring one's whole being into harmony with the true self or soul nature. So the conscientious practice of disciplines. So the practice of tapas, for example, would be a regular meditation practice. So this conscientious practice of disciplines, and through this practice, this regular meditation practice, or the conscientious practice of disciplines, doing this on a regular basis will bring one's whole being into harmony with the true self. Swami Shivananda, another 19th century Hindu spiritual teacher, again, he says, tapas is austerity. Egolessness and selfless service are the greatest forms of tapas. Humility and desirelessness are the greatest forms of austerity. Practice these through ceaseless, untiring, selfless service. So I've highlighted a few words here which describe the attitudes in how we should perform tapas. So egolessness, selfless, humility, and desirelessness are all essential when performing tapas. And then Sri Yukteswar, who was the master of Paramahansa Yogananda, he simply says, learn to behave. And what does it mean to behave? He goes on to say, conserve your powers. Daily renewed sense yearnings sap your inner peace. They are like openings in a reservoir that allow vital waters to be wasted in the desert soil of materialism. The forceful, activating impulse of wrong desire is the greatest enemy to the happiness of man. Roam in the world as a lion of self-control. Don't let the frogs of sense weakness kick you around. So here, Sri Yukteswar is very beautifully saying to give up the satisfying of our desires. Through desiring something outside of ourselves, we lose our inner peace. And it is through a lack of self-control over our desires. This is the greatest enemy to the happiness of man. Don't jump from one desire to the next like a frog. Through the practice of tapas, we can learn to roam in the world as a lion of self-control. So this is a short introduction to the topic, and I will continue now and reflect on tapas in some other spiritual traditions, beginning with Christianity and the holiday of Lent. And we can quickly draw attention to the word holiday, which traditionally meant holy day. So during Lent, Christians commit to the practice of austerities, or tapas, and dedicate themselves to fasting and daily prayer. And Lent lasts 40 days, and it is symbolic of the sacrifice that Jesus Christ made through his own journey into the desert for the same amount of time, which in itself can also be viewed as a form of tapas. So there is a section from the Gospel of Luke that I will refer to now. And the title of this short section is Jesus and the Devil. So Luke 4.1 to 4.2. When Jesus returned from the Jordan River, the power of the Holy Spirit, or Brahman, or absolute consciousness, was with him. And the Spirit, individual consciousness, led him into the desert. For 40 days, Jesus was tested by the devil. Here we can refer to the devil or Satan as what it means in Hebrew, which is obstacle. So for 40 days, Jesus was tested by the devil. And during that time, he went without eating. When it was all over, he was hungry. And to briefly elaborate on the meaning of Satan in Hebrew, which is obstacle, Jean-Yves Leloup, a 20th century theologian, he says that at the same time as our desire for union awakens what obstructs. So it was Jesus's consciousness that led him into the desert out of a longing for union with absolute consciousness. And at the same time as this desire for union awakens what obstructs. So Jesus was tested by the devil or obstacles. And Luke 4.5 to 4.8 continues, then the devil led Jesus up to a high place and quickly showed him all the nations on earth. The devil said, I will give all this power and glory to you. It has been given to me, and I can give it to anyone I want to. Just worship me, and you can have it all. Jesus answered, the scriptures say, worship the Lord your God and serve only him. So I just wanted to share this passage with you to give some context to the holiday of Lent and where it comes from, and to highlight the sacrifice through the practice of tapas, or austerities, Jesus made, fasting for 40 days in the desert, which ultimately made him so hungry for union with the divine. He traveled beyond the obstacles placed before him, resisted all temptation placed before him, and entered into a continuous state of pure awareness, also known as salvation in Christianity or enlightenment in the Eastern traditions, just like the Buddha did underneath the Bodhi tree in Bodh Gaya, India, roughly 600 years before. And this is the ultimate purpose of tapas. So we can say further, it was through divine devotion, so the natural inclination of the heart to turn towards its source, that led Jesus into the desert. The Spirit led him to the desert, this individual consciousness that is one and the same with absolute consciousness. And this pure intention of a tapas is so important, and there cannot be a more pure intention than this. And we can say that fasting through tapas should never be in order to lose weight or to boost or enhance one's appearance, perceived appearance. Tapas is a medium to bring one closer to their fundamental essence, and this alone. So when practicing tapas, no doubt one will be faced by obstacles. However, tapas should always be performed with a pure intention, with the intention to surrender the ego and go beyond the limitations of the mind and any obstacles placed before it. Not performed to enhance our sense of individuality. Performed as a means to dissolve our desires, not to satisfy them. We are training ourselves to surrender. And we can continue briefly to look at Judaism and the Sabbath. The Sabbath, which entails refraining from work from Friday evening until Saturday evening, so that people can take time to simply be with themselves and to sit before God, asking the great questions such as, who am I? And in the Gospel of Thomas, which was a gospel found in 1945 in the desert in Upper Egypt, and said to be the naked words attributed to Jesus, saying 27, Jesus said, "If you do not fast from the world, you will not find the kingdom. If you do not celebrate the Sabbath as a Sabbath, you will not know the Father." And here Jesus is simply pointing that we all, to really know our essential nature, our fundamental essence, we need to take this time away from the world to look deep inside. And through Lent and through the Sabbath, traditionally this is what people did or still do. In Buddhism, monks and nuns commonly do not eat after lunch, aiding in meditation. And then in Islam, I'm sure you're all familiar with Ramadan. So Ramadan is another period of fasting and spiritual growth, where Muslims abstain from eating, drinking, and sexual relations from dawn to sunset, instead devoting themselves to prayer and service. And on preparing this lecture, what I found really intriguing was that the etymology of Ramadan, which derives from the Arabic root ramida or ramad, means scorching heat. And also this can be compared to the etymology of tapas. The term tapas originates from the root tap, which means to give off heat. So although Ramadan is more commonly known to be called Ramadan these days because it used to take place in a summer month when it was very hot, actually we can compare it to the practice of tapas in Hinduism. And I will briefly elaborate on the role of the fire element now. So the fire element, so where does this word tapas or Ramadan come from and why? So the fire element is one of the 5 more subtle elements of the body. And the role of the fire element, it sits right in the middle between the more gross earth and water elements and the even more subtle air and ether elements. And the role of the fire element is to transform the more gross elements into the more subtle elements. So the more subtle element, the more subtle air element, the heart chakra, associated with the heart chakra, is associated with attributes such as kindness, faith, and compassion. Whereas the even more subtle elements related to ether, so Vishuddha chakra, is associated with purity and serenity. So through the practice of disciplines, we are creating an inner friction or resistance. So we can go back to what was said earlier when looking at the brief description of Satan. At the same time as our desire for union awakens what obstructs. And it is this friction between this desire for union and what is obstructing this union that creates heat and activates the fire element within us. So it is this inner fire that purifies our body, speech, and mind, sublimating the more gross energies of our being into the more subtle energies, and bringing our whole being into harmony with our essential nature. 19th century Russian mystic and philosopher Ouspensky, he has something to say about this. If a man gives way to all his desires or panders to them, there will be no inner struggle in him, no friction, no fire. But if, for the sake of attaining a definite aim, he struggles with the desires that hinder him, he will then create a fire which will gradually transform his inner struggle into a single whole. So, through the practice of tapas, we are not only awakening willpower and perseverance, which are associated with the fire element, we are awakening attributes such as kindness, faith, compassion, purity, and serenity. And when there is so much friction, so much heat, it is then as if the only option is to completely let go and surrender. And as we become more familiar with the art of letting go, through the act of surrender, we are able to transcend the lower impulses associated with separation from the whole. And with the surrender of the ego consciousness or the mind, we open ourselves to a divine will. And it is important to know that my willpower is no different from divine willpower. It is the same willpower, however, through a shift in perspective or a shift in consciousness. Instead of being claimed by the ego, it is now understood as a manifestation of the divine. We no longer identify with the doer of the action. There is a shift in consciousness from the doer to the seer, also known as the observer, the witness consciousness, or our essential nature. And with this shift comes so much freedom, so much joy. Comes egolessness, comes selflessness, humility, and desirelessness. I'm definitely going to go over the time, but let's continue anyway. So we'll continue with two warnings to be kept in mind with regard to any tapas. And This can be found in the book Be Here Now by Ramdas, the 20th century American spiritual teacher. And he says, first of all, the first warning. So austerities can be performed in ways to enhance or strengthen the ego, such as pride in how much one is suffering or dramatization. And as you have probably gathered by now, that enhancing or strengthening the ego is certainly not what we are looking for through the practice of tapas. So we can briefly refer to a story called Just Two Words. It's a story about a Zen monastery in which monks were allowed to say 2 words every 10 years. And after the first decade, one monk went to the abbot and said, "Hard bed." Quit. And the abbot replied, "This is no surprise. Ever since you arrived, all you do is complain." So here the monk was simply unable to sacrifice his suffering. And we can also share a few more words from Ouspensky on this. Another thing that people must sacrifice is their suffering. No one who has not sacrificed his suffering can work. Nothing can be attained without suffering. But at the same time, one must begin by sacrificing suffering. And where do we start with this? How can we sacrifice our suffering through the practice of tapas? So the Bhagavad Gita, the Song of God. Sacrifice is pure, which is offered by men who desire no fruit of the action. So before committing to the practice of austerities, we simply offer the fruits, our suffering, beyond success, beyond failure. We offer it all away to that very essence. And so we do not expect a beneficial outcome or the acclamation of admirers. Tapas can be practiced in a similar way to Ramana Maharshi. Ramana Maharshi was a 19th century Indian Hindu sage who was silent for almost 16 years, which is a more extreme or intense form of self-discipline, this is for sure. However, he did speak, and he said, "I did not eat, so they said I was fasting. I did not speak, so they said I was mauni, or a person in mauna, or silence." So we can imagine Ramana as one of the monks at the Zen monastery, and if he was given 2 words every 10 years, it is likely that he would offer them to another monk rather than taking them himself. Yes, if you know of the teachings of Ramana Maharshi, it is clear that whatever tapas he might have taken, he would have done so quietly and with humbleness. And then the second warning to be kept in mind. So austerities, or the practices of tapas that are excessive in relation to the degree of spiritual development of an individual, are mere demonstrations, or can be mere demonstrations of the ego, and as such can harm the practitioner in such a way as to commit to future tapas difficult or even impossible. So when committing to a tapas, one should always take into consideration the level of spiritual development, and through this determine what tapas is best to take. So somebody who has just started meditating for the very first time, to expect them to do a regular practice of a 2-hour morning meditation every day for 1 month is unrealistic. It's likely to put them off the practice of meditation for the rest of their life. So Ramdas recommends getting into the habit of remaining silent for a few hours every day, and simply starting with small things like this. And this would be a practice of tapas. And after a while, this might become a full day per week, and then even a silent meditation retreat. And perhaps as a practice of ahimsa, non-violence, one might be able to commit to a whole month without eating meat. There is the option to introduce a fast for 1 day of the week. And then during these meal times, including the preparation of the meal and the clearing away of the meal, this time can be spent meditating or practicing hatha yoga, or reading spiritual texts. And after a while, this can be extended to 3 days or even longer. And to conclude, I'll wrap this up with the echoes of a regular practice, tapas practice in daily life. So how can tapas affect our life, our daily life, our actions in daily life? So we will refer again to some words from Paramahansa Yogananda. Strengthen your willpower so that you will not be controlled by circumstances, but will control them. Now tapas is somewhat of a dangerous game, in that the more we practice tapas, the more we cultivate willpower, trust, self-confidence. And it is so important to remember that the practice of tapas is not to benefit ourselves. It could be so easy to get lost in the power of tapas and use it as a way to enhance who we are as individuals. This is not the purpose. When we talk about strengthening willpower in order to develop self-control, this is not so we can improve our personality. It is so that we have the willpower, the pure body, speech, and mind. So we are able to resist the forceful activating impulse of wrong desire and act consciously with constraint, to learn to behave. The world is crying out for mankind, for humans to simply learn how to behave. So we are not to be driven by our mind or senses, but act with selflessness from our heart. And through the practice of tapas and the constant offering of the fruits, we begin to purify. And on this journey of purification, we open more and more to a divine will and our divine nature. Thy will be done, not my will be done. So this shift in consciousness, or learning how to behave, has the power to awaken unconditional love and compassion in ourselves and all beings, and has a potential to transform the world. So we will end with a quote which I love from Mahatma Gandhi, 19th century Indian political and spiritual leader. Be the change that you wish to see in the world. And then finally a beautiful poem from Rumi, the 13th century Persian poet and Sufi mystic. I think this poem captures some of what I have been talking about. O beloved, take me, liberate my soul, fill me with your love, and release me from the two worlds. If I set my heart on anything but you, let fire burn me from the inside. O beloved, take away what I want. Take away what I do. Take away what I need. Take away everything that takes me from you. Okay, so gratitude. This is the short but not so short, slightly longer than expected, 30, 35, maybe 40-minute presentation on tapas. So grateful to have you join and take the time to be here with us this evening. Yes, and if anyone has a question or another, then now would be the time to ask. I will remain here for the next 10 minutes or so. So if anything arises in this time, please just write in the comments box and I will do my very best to answer any queries on tapas. Namaste. Okay, folks, I think we'll wrap it up there then. Thank you so much again for your time this evening. So much love to you all. And I really hope that we all meet again soon. Namaste.